At 4:47 in the morning, Tansy Holloway woke up to the sound of gravel trucks she hadn't called. She grabbed a flashlight, pulled on her father's old canvas coat, and walked out into a February fog, so thick she could barely see her own barn. But she didn't need to see it. She could smell it, that sharp, resinous stink of raw pine sawdust, thick enough to coat the back of her throat. When she reached the fence line at the edge of her 40 acres in Larkspur Hollow, Kentucky, her flashlight beam landed on something that made her stomach drop. A mountain. A literal mountain of wood waste, 12 feet high, spilled across the back third of her property, steaming faintly in the cold morning air like something alive. This wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the 50th time. For 10 years, someone had been dumping truckload after truckload of sawdust, bark, and wood scraps onto her land in the dead of night, and for 10 years, nobody had been able to prove who, or stop them, or explain why one small family farm kept absorbing what should have been an industrial company's problem. What Tansy didn't know yet, standing there in the fog with her boots sinking into wood shavings, was that this mountain of trash was about to make her a fortune and expose a secret that half the town had been keeping for a decade. Before we go further into how a mountain of factory waste turned into a $400,000 business, and the confrontation that changed everything in Larkspur Hollow, hit subscribe now. Stories like Tansy's, real accounts of ordinary landowners who outthought powerful companies, land on this channel every week, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Tansy Holloway was 38 years old when her father, Cormac Holloway, died of a heart attack behind the wheel of his tractor. She'd grown up on that land, a modest tobacco-turned-hay farm on the outskirts of Larkspur Hollow, a town so small it didn't have a stoplight, just a four-way stop and a Baptist church with a hand-painted sign. She hadn't planned on staying. She'd studied environmental science in Lexington, worked for a state agricultural extension office for 6 years, and told herself she was a city girl now, even though Lexington barely qualified as a city. But when her father died, someone had to keep the farm from going under, and Tansy's 2 brothers had already moved to Ohio for factory jobs. So she came home. What she inherited wasn't just land. It was a problem her father had fought quietly, stubbornly, and mostly alone for the better part of a decade. A quarter-mile from the Holloway property line sat Thornberry Lumber and Milling, a mid-sized sawmill that had operated in Larkspur Hollow since the 1970s, employing nearly 90 people in a county where jobs were scarce. Thornberry processed pine and oak into construction lumber, and like every sawmill in America, it generated an enormous amount of byproduct sawdust, bark, offcuts, and wood shavings. Nationally, sawmills produce roughly half a ton of waste material for every ton of usable lumber they cut. Most mills pay to have that waste hauled away, sold to paper plants, or processed into mulch and pellets. Thornberry had found a cheaper option. Cormac Holloway had first noticed piles appearing along his back fence line in the mid-2000s. Small at first, a truckload here, a truckload there, always at night, always on the far edge of the property where a decades-old survey error had left an unclear, disputed boundary between Holloway land and an unused stretch of Thornberry-adjacent easement. Cormac complained to the county. He complained to the sheriff. He even hired a surveyor once, a man named Ambrose Tilley, who confirmed that the boundary was legitimately Holloway land. Cormac kept the surveyor's report in a manila folder in the kitchen drawer for years, along with copies of every letter he'd sent to the county extension office, the sheriff's department, and, eventually, a state environmental hotline that never called him back. But farming 100 acres alone, in his 60s, with 2 sons gone and a fight that never seemed to end, wore on him in ways that were hard to measure. He kept the folder. He kept working, and slowly, he stopped calling anyone new. The dumping continued, slowly, quietly, and almost by default, it became normal. 10 years of normal, right up until the morning Tansy found the folder herself, a few weeks after the funeral, and realized her father had never actually given up. He'd simply run out of time. When Tansy took over the farm, she inherited that same fight, except now she had something her father never had: modern tools, a research background, and nothing left to lose. Her first instinct was rage. Her second was a lawsuit. But when she drove into town to speak with a lawyer, a woman named Persimmon Ashcroft, who ran a one-room practice above the hardware store, Persimmon gave her a piece of advice that would end up defining the next 2 years of Tansy's life. "Before you fight them for money," Persimmon said, "figure out what that pile is actually worth. Because right now, you're standing on it like it's garbage. It might not be. It's 12 feet of sawdust dumped on my land without permission," Tansy said. "What else would it be?" Persimmon slid a legal pad across the desk. "That depends entirely on who's asking. To Thornberry, it's a disposal cost they've been avoiding for a decade. To a nursery, it's raw material. To a judge, it might be evidence. Figure out which one gets you the most, and build your case around that, not around how angry you are." Tansy almost laughed. It felt like the kind of thing people say to make you feel better about a bad situation. But that night, unable to sleep, she found herself back at her kitchen table, with her old college textbooks, researching exactly what a waste woodpile actually contained, and what she found lit something up in her that had been dormant for years. Here's something most people don't know. Wood waste isn't waste at all. It's one of the most versatile raw materials in American agriculture, and depending on how it's processed, it can become several different high-value products. Raw sawdust and bark, left untreated, can be composted into soil amendment, but that takes months and produces a relatively low-value product. Processed correctly, though, wood waste can become biochar, a stable, carbon-rich material created by heating wood in a low-oxygen environment, a process called pyrolysis. Biochar improves soil water retention, feeds beneficial soil microbes, and can sell for 2 to 4 times the price of standard compost. Farmers and home gardeners across the country were, by the mid-2010s, paying premium prices for high-quality biochar, especially biochar blended with compost or manure. Animal bedding kiln-dried wood shavings are in constant demand from horse farms, poultry operations, and livestock producers who need clean, absorbent material and are often willing to pay a steady wholesale price for reliable suppliers. Mulch-dyed or natural, landscaping-grade mulch is a billion-dollar industry in the United States, and a huge percentage of it comes from exactly the kind of raw material sitting on Tansy's fence line. Mushroom substrate. Certain wood species, properly composted and sterilized, make excellent growing medium for gourmet mushrooms like shiitake and oyster mushrooms, a niche but fast-growing specialty crop. Tansy realized that she wasn't looking at 10 years of trespassing and ruined pasture land. She was looking, potentially, at 10 years of free raw material, millions of dollars worth of it, dumped on her land for nothing, waiting to be processed. There was also a regulatory angle Persimmon had flagged that Tansy hadn't fully appreciated. Under Kentucky's solid waste regulations, any facility that transports and deposits industrial byproduct on land not permitted to receive it can be found liable for unpermitted disposal, and repeat violations are treated as ongoing offenses rather than a single incident, meaning 10 years of nightly dumping wasn't one violation. It was potentially thousands of them. That fact alone gave Tansy far more legal leverage than her father had ever realized he had. The only problem was that she had no equipment, no capital, and a legal mess that still needed to be resolved before she could touch a single pile without risking a lawsuit over who owned what. Tansy decided to do something her father never had the strength to do. She went straight to Thornberry Lumber and asked to speak to the owner. Silas Renwick had inherited the mill from his own father and had run it for nearly 20 years. He was not, as Tansy expected, a cartoonish villain. He was a tired man in his 60s who genuinely didn't know the full extent of what had been happening on his own property line, because for a decade, the dumping runs had been handled entirely by his operations manager, a man named Roscoe Fenn, who had quietly directed night shift drivers to use the Holloway corner as an unofficial overflow site to avoid the cost of proper waste disposal, and who had been pocketing a portion of the disposal budget the company thought it was still spending. When Tansy laid out survey documents, her father's old complaint letters, and photographs spanning back nearly a decade, Renwick went pale. It wasn't just an environmental violation, it was fraud, embezzlement, and a legal liability that could have shut the mill down entirely if regulators got involved, given that unpermitted wood waste dumping can trigger investigations under state solid waste regulations, and repeated violations often carry escalating fines that start in the thousands of dollars per incident and climb from there. Renwick had two choices: fight Tansy in a drawn-out legal battle that would expose Fenn's decade of fraud and potentially cost the mill its operating permits, or find another way to make it right. "You could have called me," Renwick said quietly, staring at the photographs spread across his desk. "Any time in 10 years. My father did," Tansy said. "More than once. Nobody called back." The silence that followed lasted long enough that his office manager knocked to ask if everything was all right. Renwick waved her off. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost its defensiveness entirely. "Tell me what you want," he said, "because I'd rather fix this quietly than explain it to a state inspector." Tansy proposed a third option, one that surprised them both. Instead of a payout, Tansy asked for something more valuable: a supply agreement. Thornberry would formally, legally, and on the record, designate her property as an approved receiving site for a fixed volume of wood byproduct with proper permitting, proper insurance, and a small per-ton fee paid to her, not the other way around. In exchange, she would drop all legal claims related to the past 10 years. Renwick, desperate to avoid a scandal and quietly furious with Fenn, who was fired within the month, agreed almost immediately. Overnight, Tansy went from trespass victim to legitimate business owner with a guaranteed, contracted supply of raw material, something most wood recycling startups spend years and enormous capital trying to secure. She used a small inheritance, a farm service agency loan, and a used equipment auction 2 counties over to buy her first real piece of processing equipment: a second-hand tub grinder for breaking down bark and offcuts, and later, a small-scale biochar kiln built partly from a converted shipping container, a setup increasingly common among small-scale biochar producers because it dramatically lowers startup costs compared to industrial pyrolysis units. Her first year of real production was almost comically small: a few pallets of bagged mulch sold at the county farmers market, a handful of biochar bags sold through a regional gardening co-op. But Tansy had something most competitors didn't: a free, reliable, contracted raw material stream, and a decade of pent-up local goodwill from neighbors who remembered her father's long, quiet fight. Word spread. A regional landscaping supplier placed a standing bulk order for mulch. A horse farm 40 miles away signed a contract for bedding. A specialty foods company, drawn by the novelty of reclaimed Kentucky hardwood biochar, began sourcing from her for a boutique soil amendment line sold in garden centers across 3 states. By year 3, Tansy had hired 2 full-time employees, including, in a twist that made the local paper, a former Thornberry forklift driver who'd once helped load the very trucks that dumped on her land, expanded her kiln operation, and diversified into mushroom substrate for a growing network of small specialty mushroom farms across the region, an industry that had been quietly expanding across the U.S. as demand for gourmet and medicinal mushrooms increased. She also started selling a smaller, unexpected product line, kiln-charred fence posts and rustic garden edging, cut from oversized offcuts that were too irregular for mulch or biochar, but had a rough-hewn look that landscapers and hobby farmers were willing to pay extra for. It wasn't a large share of her revenue, but it was the product that made the local news segment that eventually got her noticed by a regional gardening co-op. By year 5, her operation, now formally named Holloway Reclamation Farms, was doing just under $400,000 in annual revenue, built almost entirely from a raw material that for 10 years had been treated as worthless. There's a moment, Tansy has said in interviews since, that stuck with her more than any of the financial milestones. It was the day she stood at that same fence line, the one where she'd found the mountain of dumped sawdust years earlier, except this time it wasn't a mess. It was neat, tarped rows of raw material waiting for processing, labeled by delivery date, part of a legitimate, contracted, growing business. She thought about her father, Cormac, who had spent the last years of his life exhausted by a fight he didn't have the resources to win. She thought about how close she'd come to seeing that same pile as nothing but a burden, a decade of resentment stacked 12 feet high. The lesson she took from it, and the one she now shares at agricultural conferences and local extension workshops, is one that applies far beyond wood waste. Almost nothing in farming is truly worthless. Manure becomes fertilizer. Crop residue becomes livestock feed or biochar. Even a decade of illegal dumping, if you understand what you're actually looking at, can become the foundation of a business. Today, Holloway Reclamation Farms supplies biochar, mulch, animal bedding, and mushroom substrate to customers across 3 states. Tansy still maintains her original supply agreement with Thornbury Lumber, now under new operations management, and the two businesses once locked in a decade-long, quiet conflict now sit on each other's promotional materials as a local sustainability partnership. Roscoe Fenn, the former operations manager who had orchestrated the illegal dumping to pocket disposal funds, was never criminally charged, but he was quietly blacklisted from the local industry, and the case became something of a cautionary tale among mill operators in the region about oversight and internal audits of waste disposal costs. Tansy Holloway, once just a woman standing in the fog at 4:47 in the morning, staring at someone else's mess, is now regularly asked to speak about reclaimed material entrepreneurship, a growing niche as more small landowners and farmers realize that industrial waste streams, handled with the right knowledge and the right leverage, can be turned into legitimate, sustainable income. Her advice to anyone facing a similar situation on their own land is simple. Document everything. Understand the actual value of what's being dumped or wasted, and never assume that a problem dumped on you has to stay a problem. If this story taught you something about the hidden value sitting on farmland all across America, make sure you're subscribed, because we bring you a new true farm story like this one every single week. Real people, real land, and real turnarounds you won't hear anywhere else. Drop a comment below and tell us what you'd have done in Tansy's shoes, and we'll see you in the next one.